Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another chapter of webinar series done by Liberal Youth Movement. Sorry, my videos. Welcome to another chapter of webinar series done by Liberal Youth Movement. First of all, I would like to give you a brief explanation about Liberal Youth Movement since I can see so many new faces here. So, Liberal Youth Movement started in 2022. From that onwards, we've been working through bridging the gaps between our youth generation and the experts of the country. Most especially, we've been working with youth around the country about LGBT reforms, SOV reforms, and also on economic reforms. Since our country is at a very critical point economically right now, I think it's very important our youth to get a knowledge on economic policies, most especially about why they should learn about economic policies different. That's why upcoming elections are very important because whoever comes to the power will have to navigate this country through these economical challenges. Today, to talk about that, we have one of our greatest experts on economics, Dr. Shamini Kure, former director of International Monetary Fund. I'd like to hand over to the doctor to continue her session. And also, while she's doing her session, all of you are welcome to raise any questions you might have. You can raise your questions from English, Sinhala, or Tamil. Thank you.
Thank you, Shan. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to talk to this group. I'm very honored because I think liberal, it's very, I can see the Wealth of Nations and John Stuart Mill's book on liberty on your shelf. And those are really the foundations of the kind of economics I'm talking about. And it is about, economics is embedded in liberal philosophy in recognizing the rights of the individual for self-determination, for making their own economic choices, and for the rule of law, and also for recognizing that the role of the state really has to be about facilitating markets and creating a level playing field and not hindering markets so that individuals can have freedom of economic and also, of course, political choices. So anyway, let me get quickly to my topic. I'm going to now, actually I have a PowerPoint. So let me see if I can get onto my PowerPoint. So I'm going to, I think I had to say share content, correct? Screen. If you'll excuse me, I'm not the world's biggest expert on this, so hold on. Hold on, Chan, I'm sorry. I just want to get my presentation. Can you see my presentation? Sean? No? Okay, let me just try to share the screen again, okay? Sorry. Screen. Start broadcast. Okay, let me just bring up my PowerPoint. Can you see my screen now? Yeah?
Yes, doctor, we can see.
Okay, very good. So let me just start it. Sorry. All right. Why isn't it from start? Okay, very good. All right. So I'm going to talk about strengthening the economic foundations and the reform priorities, as Shan was saying, this year, which is an election year and very crucial. And please do interrupt me if you have any questions. And Shan, let me know if I should pause. Okay, very good. So I will first talk about the reasons for the crisis and then talk about what we can do to address it and what the priorities are. So, Sri Lanka has, for many years, we've had long-standing structural problems. And we haven't really, what happened? Okay. Can you see me? Can you see the screen? Yeah. Okay. So basically, I like to think of this as being 4 pillars on which our economic foundation rests. Our economy rests on 4 foundations, right? And this is how I'm seeing it. So the first pillar is about a sustainable and inclusive fiscal position. That's really what the foundation of a strong economy has, that as a foundation. Now, unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, successive governments have basically have not been responsible fiscally. They have given universal benefits, not targeted towards people who need it, but just for everybody. And they have also given to inefficient and frankly corrupt state enterprises. They have squeezed investment like health and education and relief for the poor. Those expenditures have over time been squeezed. And at the same time as the spending was rising, they failed to raise tax revenue to pay for this. It's like if you have a household and you have all these expenditures, you really need to be earning income. Well, the government didn't earn enough income. It spent. And what happened was that it had big deficits. Like in a household, you can't have big difference between your earnings and your spending. And so they borrowed. And like a household, you can borrow, except when you borrow, you have to pay interest. And the rising interest bill in Sri Lanka was financed by even more borrowing, leading to an unsustainable debt, which has grown now to over about 120% of GDP. That GDP is the concept of income in the economy, right? So it's like the income of a household in the economy, it's the GDP. And the second pillar is an independent central bank. The central bank is accountable for monetary and financial stability. That is, the basic job of a central bank is not to finance government. It's not the government's banker, frankly. It's a protector of your money. The 100 rupees that you have in your pocket should buy the same goods and services for you every year. And not devalue, not lose its value in terms of what it can buy. But in Sri Lanka, the central bank lacked independence to fulfill this mission, and it was mainly financing government deficits. These big deficits, the borrowing was partly done from the central bank. And as a result, monetary policy and the control of inflation was politically influenced. So this is one aspect of the important aspect of the economy. The second pillar. The third pillar is, like I was referring to, the state should not be engaging directly in commercial activities. The job of the state is to really focus on fostering market competition, right? I mean, markets have to be able to, individuals have to be able to transact in a market. And, I say, and support private sector. Now, when I say private sector, I don't mean just large enterprises. I mean, people like you and me who might want to start a business. We don't want a government that is hindering that. But in fact, our history has not, unfortunately, been that. We've had a very large, inefficient public sector, that is state-owned enterprises that have engaged directly in commercial activities. Airlines, growing, owning land and growing crops and sort of, we have something like 160 corporations that engage in commercial activity. There are like 400 state-owned enterprises, but they're not all of them are commercial, but a full 160 of them are engaged in commercial activity, and these run losses, and they have been subsidized and by the government, and also these deficits, the losses have been hidden because the three large state-owned banks, that is NSB, Bank of Ceylon, and People's Bank, now have bad debts amounting to about 2% of GDP that are sitting in their books that you and I don't see, but those banks have weak loan portfolios. I have put here on the slide a quote from the IMF's governance diagnostic assessment that talks about corruption. And it says, and you will see from the quote, it says, high value corruption issues are strongly associated with these state-owned enterprises. And there are close relationships between these public institutions, the state-owned enterprises, and private firms. So, that shouldn't happen, because what it's really doing is favoring certain private firms and individuals. The fourth pillar is really having an open trade, open economy that is open to trade from the rest of the world and encourages exports. Now, the reason this is important is because, small countries like Sri Lanka, we can't grow with just our domestic market. We need to export to the rest of the world. That is how small countries like Korea develop. They exported to the rest of the world. Korea used to be poorer than Sri Lanka in the 60s, and they're now way richer. How? They exported their way into prosperity, and they forced their firms to compete in the world markets. You can think of the Scandinavian countries, which are also small. They're small, they're not big countries, but they have, for ages, for many, many decades, they've been traders. They have traded, and they are open economies. So, but we did have trade liberalization in the late 70s. But then even after that, these trade restrictions were reintroduced. And basically, on supposedly to protect average consumer like you and me. But actually what they really do is favor monopolistic, producers. There are one or two producers. They basically get privilege, their competition is blocked. And then you and I pay high prices. And there's corruption that goes along with getting this protection. And politicians basically restrict imports in return for favors from these, including funding elections, frankly, from these domestic producers. So the state, instead of fostering competitive markets, has been fostering anti-competitive practices, which you and I pay higher prices for. And again, I have put a quote in here because what I'm saying, you might think, well, where's the evidence? But the governance diagnostic, and if you haven't read it, I highly encourage you to read it. It's available on the IMF's website, and it's basically looking at corruption issues in Sri Lanka and poor governance. So basically what they say is that in the quote, what it's saying is that the top government officials do not have accountability because there's a lot of control over market forces, and there is over-regulation of sectors like agriculture, electricity, and construction, and this gets in the way of market-based accountability. And one indication of our anti-trade, anti-competitive practices is that our exports fell from something like 39% of GDP in 2000 to about 21.5% of GDP in 22. So it's just completely declined. And 21.5% of GDP is just way too small. A country like us, who is small, should have a exports to GDP ratio of 50%. So this has been a problem. Now, you might wonder how, after all these years, we suddenly got into this crisis. How did that happen? Well, so I'm going to focus on the period from 2019 to 22 to just quickly give you, because we are suffering from a lot of the things we have to fix it illustrates how badly things can go wrong when you don't have what I will argue is proper legal frameworks to protect us from poor decision making, arbitrary economic decision making. So in November 2019, taxes were cut sharply, all taxes, corporate, personal, VAT. And the tax ratio, that is the ratio of taxes to GDP, fell to 7.5%. It had been about 12% in 2021. It fell very sharply to 7.5%. And of course, this led to large fiscal deficits. It's like you suddenly, your household, you suddenly lose your income. I mean, the same thing for the government. The government suddenly just voluntarily gave up its income and, of course, ran big deficits. When we were borrowing from, I remember I said we essentially were relying on borrowing, and the international bond markets cut off Sri Lanka from bond markets because when they saw the tax cuts, the risk premium on Sri Lankan bonds rose sharply, and we were cut off from international markets in early 2020. And we couldn't borrow abroad. And the public debt, so we turned to borrowing domestically. Okay, and the public debt went from something like 89% of GDP in end of 2019 to as much as 114% at the end of 21. So in other words, 25 percentage points of GDP in just 2 years. I'll show you a picture of this. So basically, here's what I'm talking about. You can see the blue column is revenue, and the revenues fall sharply after 2019 because they were introduced in November 2019. And you can see the expenditures keep going up, the red column, and the overall deficit increases, right? The black line. Then on the right-hand side chart, you can see the blue line shows you how the debt exploded from 20, it was high before, but it really exploded after 2019. So this is one aspect. The other aspect, remember I said that the central bank, the second pillar, so first pillar is fiscal discipline, which we lacked. And then the second was central bank independence. But the central bank lacked independence, so it financed a large part of the deficit. The deficit was financed both from borrowing from the central bank and from the public. And the central bank basically what we call net credit to government, that is the central bank's holding of government, treasury bonds and government instruments, borrowing instruments, grows very sharply. It grew 140% in 2020 and again in 21. And so as an offset to this, international reserves fell. I don't want to get into the mechanics of it, but if you give credit to government, they are offsetting things in the central bank's balance sheet. And basically what happened is we lost reserves by then the government spent all the money that the central bank was printing for it. And then the money base, that is the base of the central bank, our money supply grew by over 50%. Again, I'll show you a chart. These are charts from the IMF's annual report. I will show you. You can see here that the red line is not important. On the left-hand side, you can see the blue line shows CBSL holdings of government securities. You can see how they were fairly low before, and after 2019, you see in 2020 and 21, it rises sharply. Look at the difference between 2016 and 2022. Huge increase in government financing of government deficits by the central bank. And you can see on the right-hand side, the blue lines are those treasury bills going up, and then the red is the loss in international reserves. And you see the black line is how sharply the reserve money grew. The scale on this chart, 50% is a lot for a rate of growth. So this is basically what happened and why we are in a crisis. I also want to show, I mentioned the tax revenue being low because we cut the tax rates. You can see here, I'm comparing, Sri Lanka is in the red column. So by 2022, our tax ratio had gone up a bit to 8.3. We're still one of the lowest we have one of the lowest tax ratios in the world. Only Lebanon is below us in comparable countries. But look at countries like Thailand and Philippines and Malaysia and India. I mean, these are the countries that are like us, and they have a tax ratio closer to 20% of GDP. So these are the issues that we face. And then, of course, the imports were restricted in the 29 to 22 period. You'll remember the ban on chemical fertilizers, and that led to a sharp drop in agriculture output. And on top of that, although the government was advised to go to the IMF for assistance, they did not, and waited way too late. It was only in 2022 that the government approached the IMF, and because the IMF is the world's lender of last resort. So, we waited till the very last moment, and that's why things are so bad. That's why the crisis happened. Inflation, when you have not money printing, but credit to government of this order of magnitude and money increasing, inflation just shot up, and inflation reached 70% of GDP, 70% at the annual rate in September 22. So this is why we ended up with this massive crisis and a big debt. Now, these are the messages looking forward. Let's look forward. We know what happened. Basically, when we look forward, I mean, these are my main messages. One thing that worries me a lot is, even though we are now in debt restructuring discussions, and we can expect they'll conclude fairly quickly, hopefully, but even after debt restructuring, Sri Lanka will face a very tight fiscal situation. We are not out of the woods. And even after restructuring, our debt to GDP ratio will only decline to about 95% of GDP by the year 2028. That is still very high. And so I can show this later if you're curious about it. I can show you the numbers. But basically, as I said, raising the tax revenue ratio is really important. We are now at 9%, 9.5% of GDP. That's way too low. We have to get to about 14% of GDP to be out of, in a better shape, to be able to have normal functioning government expenditures that are not on interest payments. Most of our tax revenues are going for interest payments. We don't have a whole lot of money for things like health and education and cash transfers to poor people. So we have to manage our public finances better. And we have to generate, as part of the debt deal, we have to generate large fiscal surpluses, excluding interest rates, which we can't do without having tax revenue. So my point is that the only way out of this particular corner we are in is through strong, sustainable growth. We have to have, I think, about annual GDP growth of about 6% on a sustained basis over the next decade, not just a year or two, but for about 10 years before we can get our debt down to something sustainable and also be able to finance the kind of expenditures we need to develop. Now, the growth, we have in the past had growth that is state-focused, public investment-driven, financed by borrowing. We have to change this model. We have to have more liberal economic policies, that is, policies that are market-oriented, export-oriented, led by the private sector, and inclusive. The public sector, the role of the public sector has to change from one of sort of doing things directly, over-controlling the economy, to really enabling private actors, private sector, not just big firms, like I said, but even small entrepreneurs to succeed. They shouldn't have to be running behind politicians to get permits for this, that, and the other. So the government has a role to play, and that is to regulate when there are failures in the market, right? So you shouldn't be able to pollute or produce substandard products. Though that is a legitimate role for government, but not to sort of create unnecessary licensing and things that only force people to go to politicians to get to do funded basic economic activity. So what do we have a very big agenda, like these pillars I talked about. We have a very big agenda, but I think the priority in 24, I would argue, is to, it's an election year. We have a lot of political uncertainty, and we need to create strong legal frameworks and independent, accountable economic institutions like the Ministry of Finance, the central bank, other institutions that will commit future governments to good governance on the four foundational economic pillars I was talking about. So let me elaborate on this. So I'm going to talk about, so first of all, these ideas. So let me talk about, so where would this growth come from? We have to realize that Sri Lanka's population growth is slowing. We are basically at about, it's a stable, our population is not growing anymore, it'll stabilize. And so the growth has to really come from productivity increases and investment. And like I said, it needs to be private sector led because the government is now constrained by very high debt and low tax ratio. Even if we get it to 14%, the tax ratio, that's still very low. There isn't a whole lot of room. And the government spending, it's not that the spending itself is high. Our big problem is our tax ratio is too low. Now, the government spending is about 20% of GDP, which is reasonable, but it's spent on the wrong things. We have to take it away from these untargeted subsidies and subsidies to state-owned enterprises towards more spending on health, public education, cash transfers to the poor. So we have to reorient our public spending. Then we have to get market-oriented reforms so that the private sector can be competitive, because otherwise the private sector can't create good jobs. And if you have a lot of political interference and over-regulation, and as part of that, the commercially oriented SOEs will need to be privatized. And that way the state gets out of the business of producing directly. Then our growth will have to be export oriented. That is because we need the foreign exchange. We need to be able to service our external debt, build up international reserves, which is a kind of cushion, finance imports, and the domestic producers must basically be made to export into and face real competition and not really be protected and controlled so that there's no competition from imports. And the other thing, that growth has to be inclusive. That is, we can't have a strong export-oriented economy unless we have a healthy, productive, educated population. Extremes of wealth and income are not consistent with high productivity growth and sustainable growth. So these are the kind of growth we have to have. So what are the priorities? I would argue that we need, like I said, that we need to have legal frameworks, strong legal frameworks, so that governments just can't come and just do whatever they want. That's what happened in 2019. There was no restraint on the government, and they did things that damaged all of us. So and ask yourself, why have we had 17 IMF supported programs? The IMF is not a development bank. The IMF is the worst lender of last resort. The IMF is there when countries are in trouble. And how come we've gone 17 separate times to the IMF? So it means we are perpetually in some kind of trouble. So we've not had policy continuity, and we need stability and policy continuity to really have sustained growth. So I would say, let's talk about the pillars. Pillar one, how do we get the fiscal position strengthened? Well, we need to pass, we need to have better public management, public financial management. But there's a bill that is been promised as part of the IMF supported program, but it has not yet passed Parliament. We should enact it because it really strengthens our budgeting rules, our budgeting process, and the fiscal rules. We need some guidance so that the governments are constrained from just acting in ways that damage the economy. We should also enact a public procurement law. I'm not sure just in case you don't know exactly what procurement is. Procurement is the government buys goods and services. Think of things like medicine. There's been a medicine scandal, right? So there is procurement, but we have no law that puts a process in place to purchase goods like medicine or fertilizer or all kinds of things that the government actually purchases. There's no law. It just basically the cabinet can do whatever it wants, and that's, you can read the governance diagnostic I was talking about, and they address this issue. And so the idea is to have a public procurement law that reflects good international practices. And the other thing is to move our public procurement into an e-government system, so it's transparent, so people can see what is up for tender, what are the rules, who has won the tender, and you can ask questions, and you should publish. The e-government system should be available to everybody to see. And we should also target the social safety net. Aswasuma had some problems in terms of how well targeted it is, and it needs to be better targeted. And so that also we need to, as I said, move our composition of spending towards health and education, away from subsidies and military spending. Military takes up about 45% of the wage bill. And so we need to have less. I don't know why we need a huge military. We need to support poor people through this difficult process. The second aspect of the pillar one, I talked about taxes. We have two tax acts that are very damaging. One is the Strategic Development Project Act. And this act basically allows the government to give, under calling something strategic, can give tax breaks to corporations that primarily benefit the shareholders of these corporations. They're big corporations, big companies, or favored companies, and they get tax breaks from everything, from VAT, personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, a lot of tax breaks that get. And if they don't pay taxes, then you and I pay taxes through a higher VAT, for example. So the other one that I think should be abolished, frankly, is the Special Commodities Levy Act. You will recall the sugar scandal and the garlic scandal. Well, those things happen because the ministers have any minister, and this is not new to this government, and it's always it's existed for some years, is that basically what happened is it increased, the minister can just suddenly overnight introduce a levy and then take it off. And it allows people who have inside information to, as you know, to bring in products and then sell them at high prices. So these acts should be abolished. And we should create a single tax policy department in the Ministry of Finance that'll take all customs tax, excise taxes, all these tax policy, including tax exemptions, to be approved by that tax policy department. And all tax changes should be assessed through a cost-benefit analysis, and then transparently explain to Parliament, how why the taxes are being changed. This is not something a minister should be able to do overnight. And we should pass an overarching tax law that says that tax and customs rates have to be set according to standard schedules. So you can't just simply turn up and undo them. And they have to be presented to Parliament for approval. So you get rid of ministerial authority to change taxes through Gazette notifications, and should also mandate there's a global minimum tax that has been agreed internationally. Sri Lanka has not agreed to it. It's one of about 4 countries out of 150 countries or so that have not signed up. We should sign up for that, and everybody agrees to have a global corporate minimum tax of 15%. And Port City should be subject to this. Port City is full of, the law allows basically these companies to operate without paying any taxes whatsoever. And that's just not right. The government will have expenses related to Port City, and they should pay taxes of at least 15%. And having predictable taxes is really, I think, not arbitrary, just a standard tax. It's not difficult. And this law should also provide the legal framework for the tax policy department I was talking about. The other thing I think we have to do is have better governance on tax administration. The diagnostic report I was talking about, the one that the IMF did on Sri Lanka, is very critical of the corruption in the tax administration, that is IRD, customs and excise departments. And one of the things they recommend is that we have fully digitized and operationalized the RAMIS. It's a tax system, it's a digital system, record keeping and pulling records together. And the IMF has given us a lot of technical assistance to establish a large taxpayer unit and a unit for high net worth individuals. They have not been properly staffed or empowered for years. Well, we should properly staff them, pay bonuses to attract IT, accounting, and other professional skills that are needed. The current IRD does not have these skills. Of course, you have to pay better than government pay scales. But we have the private sector, plenty of IT, accounting, and other essential expertise, legal. So they should pay and get these so that large taxpayers are paying. The chart shows how much after 2019 the number of taxpayers fell drastically. And make no mistake, not paying taxes is basically, we need to tax rich people. I mean, better off people are not being taxed enough. Either they're, through businesses and other things. I mean, they need to pay more taxes. Instead of which we are taxing through goods and services like VAT. But the answer is not to lower VAT. It's really to collect taxes from people who can afford to pay them, and then lower the VAT rate if we get to adequate tax ratio. So we should also pass a Tax Administration Act. I mean, it turns out in Sri Lanka, you can basically not pay taxes and you're not subject to any much punishment. And you should really have criminal charges for tax evasion and bribery. I mostly spend my time in the US, and I can tell you, if you don't pay your taxes here, you will be sent to jail. You can be prosecuted. It's no small thing. People take it very seriously to pay their taxes. So, it's not because people are better behaved in countries that have better tax ratios. It's just that there are serious penalties for not paying your taxes. You can end up in jail. So let me also then talk about the other pillars. The central bank. I mean, one piece of good news is that the Pillar 2, we enacted the Central Bank Act of 2023, and that was a major achievement. It's a good act. Some things that I think could be better, but it's good enough. And we should ensure that the central bank independence is safeguarded. Politicians love to attack the central bank because they wanted to basically finance public spending, which allows them to be responsible. I showed you the cost of when a central bank finances government deficit. So the Act does not allow it to do it. It does not allow the central bank to fund the government, except for a temporary period. But now that period will be over soon. And so we should protect the independence of the central bank. And a third pillar in that area on commercial activities is, there's a state-owned enterprise reform policy that the cabinet approved last May. And there is a state-owned enterprise reform law, a draft law that is being discussed. And it should be passed because if we have a law, and this law basically takes away the control of the state-owned enterprises from the line ministries, that is from all the various ministries, and puts it under the Ministry of Finance, and basically establishes an independent, professionally run holding company. Singapore has called Temasek, and Malaysia. These countries have such holding companies for state-owned enterprises, and basically you have an independent board in the state holding company, and there's an independent advisory committee that recommends the directors for the board. So they're not political appointees. And basically, this law has not yet been passed, and it needs to be passed. We should privatize the commercially oriented state-owned enterprises. As I said, there are 160 of them. I think the government, it's a good thing, has started to look into privatizing Sri Lanka and a few of the other enterprises, and this should really proceed. So the start has been made, but we don't need the law to privatize, but it's better to have it, but at least we can make a start. And we should eliminate the domestic price controls and penalize anti-competitive practices. I'm talking about, people, the price of eggs are controlled, the price of things are controlled. It doesn't benefit us. Basically, these price controls protect inefficient producers and allow people to establish monopolies, that is anti-competitive things. So the government should be doing the opposite, which is penalizing producers that engage in anti-competitive practices. On the fourth pillar, I would say a priority is to really remove the import controls and licensing. It is a form of not only corruption, but also, again, protecting domestic producers who are inefficient. And to bring these imports under standard, that I was talking about the tax bill. I mean, so we should have standardized customs duty schedules. If you have customs duty schedules, you will collect revenue for the government, but you also have a very predictable amount you pay. You can have a very high amount for luxury cars and have no duties on food, for example. But the important thing is that the government should actually enforce in a transparent way things like health standards, environmental standards, and safety standards. So you shouldn't be able to just import something that is say equipment that is shoddy and dangerous and will harm the person operating the equipment. So having good standards and enforcing them, that is a proper role of government. You shouldn't be allowed to import or pollute or do things that are harm the environment or have bad medicines. And those are the proper role of government, is to kind of have independent regulators who will ensure that these things are performing as advertised and not harming, creating public harm. So that is basically my priorities that I will identify, and I'm happy to take any questions. So let me get back in the presentation. I was wondering, is there a way for me to close this out, Sean? Sean, is there, right.
Doctor, just click stop sharing on top of your iPad.
Yes, I'm trying to. Is that okay now?
Yes, no.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Sean, are you seeing me now? And
Yes, doctor. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, my mic was mute and I couldn't unmute myself.
Okay, so I'm open for questions. So happy to answer. And I apologize. I'm sorry I can't talk in technical things in Sinhalese or in Tamil.
That's
I'm just not good enough. I can't, but I certainly understand a bit of Sinhalese. I mean, I understand Sinhalese. I can talk casual Sinhalese. So if you want to people want to ask questions in Sinhalese or in Tamil, please, I'm happy to hear. But I can understand the Sinhalese probably, I think. But I'll try to see if I can answer in Sinhalese, but I'm not very good at it. I get stuck for words. I'm sorry about that.
That's fine, doctor. We'll translate. And thank you so much for the session. It was very informative. And before we are going for other questions from our participants, I would like to ask two questions. So first one is, why do you think mandating this 15% global minimum tax for all corporation is important? Why is it important? Why was it highlighted as an important part of your pillars that?
Okay, so basically, there has been a problem across the whole world, and the governments in the OECD countries, which is a club of rich countries, have got together, and the problem has been that that countries are competing with each other to cut corporate taxes. It's a race to the bottom, and this is depriving countries, both rich and poor, of tax revenue. So because of that, I think a year or two ago, they agreed on a global, something called BEPS, Base Erosion and Profit Sharing. That's the agreement. It has two pillars. And one of them is to have a global minimum tax. So basic idea is, and by the way, as I said, something like 140, 50 countries have signed up to it. Only 4 or 5, like Sri Lanka, haven't, and Nigeria and Pakistan, but India, China, European countries have signed on. And basically what it says is, if a company is given a tax break in any country in the world, if they pay less than 15%, so say they get a tax break of, they only have to pay 5% taxes, the home country, that is the country to which that company belongs, that their home country will tax them for at least another 10% more. So basically, we'll be giving up revenue that, say, an Indian company comes here and we give them a tax break, the Indian government will collect 15% of their profits. Why don't we collect it? That is why this global minimum tax exists. And frankly, it is utterly irrational to ask a company not to pay taxes. I mean, that is crazy, because all companies should pay taxes. Look, time after time, when we do investor surveys of investors, why don't they come to Sri Lanka? We have very low foreign direct investment. They don't mention taxes. What they mention is stable economic environment, stable policies, protection of private property, availability of land. So why are we giving these tax breaks? It's because we basically, on the guise of encouraging foreign companies, we give these breaks to domestic companies. They're the biggest beneficiaries of all of this. And why zero? I mean, you should collect something. What's the point of giving zero taxes? That means that the burden of taxes goes to somebody else. So we should learn from a country like Ireland. Ireland, I worked on Ireland, has a low tax rate. It used to be 12%. Now they've agreed to raise it to 15% because of this global tax agreement. But it's uniform, not many exemptions. Corporations can't kind of, make excuses and kind of have a lot of deductions and things. It's a flat standard rate. Do you know that Ireland collects so much tax revenue that they're now creating a wealth fund? So where's the evidence that tax breaks work? There's no international evidence. We have given tax breaks and we don't even have any FDI, foreign direct investment. So that's why I'm saying collect something. Even for Port City, collect a standard, at least a minimum tax for companies that are making profits. They're earning an income basically, and you and I have to pay taxes on income. Why don't they? So it's a myth that companies don't invest. My attitude is to say, if they are not generating profits to pay 15% minimum tax, they shouldn't be operating. Clearly, we need to have better, more efficient companies. So that's my answer.
Okay, doctor, that explained actually. You explained very well about the problem I had. Now we have a question from Udeni, one of our participants in the chat.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am, giving this opportunity. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to ask some kind of a logistic question, right? For developing countries, like Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is one of the Asian Pacific country, and according to my point of view, the European system is not always feasible when it comes to a country like Sri Lanka, right? The taxation, right? When even in the crisis situation that we have been, suffering for a long time of period, that the government always find the taxation as their only solution, right? And sometimes they overburden all those things even under, even over the, I mean, innocent citizens, right? Some kind of, when it comes to reality, some meager wages also, right? The meager wages, right? I'm just asking, right? What are the I'm just asking, what is the government, right? What sort of procedure that they should have, right? So we have seen, right, when it comes to practicality, some austerity measures also they have taken, right? So that is the what happens in the practical arena. So I'm just asking, what sort of opinion that you have, so how it should be centralized in a country like Sri Lanka. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Look, I agree. The issue of taxes is really important. And you're right, we don't have to be like Europe. European countries collect 40% of GDP in taxes, 40. Nordic countries collect over 50. We don't have to be like that. We can be like our Asian neighbors, like Thailand. I showed you that graph. If you look in that graph, countries like India, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, they're collecting about 18 to 20%. That's what we should be going for. We used to, do you know that our tax ratio used to be about 20%, maybe 10 years ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago? We have forgotten that we had a much higher tax ratio before. Why do we need taxes? First let me explain. Why is it taxes? The reason it has to be taxes is like the government is like a household. It needs income. If you want the government to spend on health, on education, on law, security, street lamps, roads, investment that you need roads, we need train system, electricity. That's a public enterprise, but it's, to some extent, there's some government spending that goes with it. If you want these things, then where is the income going to come from? So you ask yourself that. The government's only real means of income is taxation. That is true all over the world. The government cannot engage in commercial activity and earn profits. It is extremely inefficient, subject to political patronage, and none of our state enterprises generates much revenue. And they're not as good as the private sector when they try. So the taxes all the world over, the only way that the government raises revenue. Everybody contributes. That's the concept. So we can't. What you cannot do is keep borrowing, because when you borrow, the debt keeps growing, and if the debt grows, you have to pay interest. And at the moment, do you know that 80%, 77% of our tax revenues are going on paying debt, interest on debt? And this is not just foreign interest. This is domestic interest from domestic bonds, from treasury bills that the banking system and the EPF and all these people are holding. So it's simple arithmetic that the government needs tax revenue. Now, who should pay the taxes? You're quite right. It shouldn't be poor people. But Sri Lanka over the years has not taxed rich people enough. And it has relied on what we call indirect taxes. That is things like sales taxes and VAT and import duties, which get reflected in the prices of goods, which is very unfair to poorer people, less well-off people, because they spend a lot of their income on goods and services. So when they don't save a lot, they just, most of their income goes, say, for food, and food will have taxes embedded in that. So so we have to change the structure of taxation towards increasing tax funds. Look, direct taxes, even now, okay, people complain, but it's only covering the top 15% of the population, the income earners. You know, the 100,000 a month limit, you know, you don't have to pay if you earn less than 100,000 a month. That is basically the top 15% of the income of the population. You know, it's only the highest income earners, 15%. So you know, it's not correct to say that income taxes go to tax people who are not that well off. 100,000 is a pretty decent income in Sri Lanka. You may not. The reason people feel it is because the inflation that took place in 22 lowered the value of the rupee, I mean, what we earn. So, of course, the taxes come on top of that. But that is the only solution. But the thing is that we have to do two things. Shift the burden from indirect taxes like VAT to direct taxes, which are income taxes. That's why I say corporations should be paying taxes. Why should poor people pay VAT when corporations are not paying anything? Or some, you know, corporations are not paying anything. So that's one. And there is plenty of scope to bring more people under the tax net, more richer people and corporations. And the second thing to do is to, you know, to kind of collect the taxes that bring people under the net. So shift from indirect to direct taxes, and then bring more people under the tax net. I mean, I say bring more people. They're not in the system. You know, there are only 400,000 tax files. In Sri Lanka, used to have 1.7 million tax files. So you know, we have to do better that way. But basically, a government that doesn't earn taxes, doesn't have enough tax revenue, basically has to then not provide free health care. We won't be able to provide free education. Our education and health spending is very, very low. So then the only solution is for us now, for the government to not be able to spend. But remember, interest bill is now very large, and over, you know, 77% at the moment is going towards paying interest because we borrowed in the past. So that's why we have to, you know, it's not a matter of being like Europe. I'm saying be responsible. A country like Thailand has a fiscal deficit of 1% of GDP. And they have a public debt ratio of about 55% of GDP. We have 14% at the moment. It's come down a bit from 120. So, you know, we're spending a lot on interest payments. I hope that answers your question, Lulu.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Your answer is very, you know, very explanatory. Actually, I just want to get to know that how it comes when it comes to the practicality. Your answer is a well-equipped answer. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it is practical. We can do it. You know, we've done it in the past. We've just mismanaged this situation for a few years, but we can get back to it. It's practical. Other countries do it. We're one of the lowest in the world for collecting taxes.
Thank you, Doctor. Next, we have Chaminda. And Chaminda, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, Doctor. First of all, I would like to thank for giving me this opportunity. Doctor, I read your oration speech at Central Bank 76, I think, Central Bank anniversary. So in that, you said clearly what has happened to Sri Lanka. It's a very comprehensive document and really giving a very good idea about Sri Lanka. So my question is, in your today's presentation, you said in your proposals to remove import controls and licensing. So we have a debt to GDP ratio of around 128%, roughly, as per your article.
Mm-hmm.
And even after restructuring, it will come down to 95% in 2032. Right. At the moment, we have roughly around 4.5 million US dollars reserves. So in that type of a scenario, so when we are going to repay the capital of the our loans, so how can we remove import controls, especially say importing of vehicles? Can you please explain on that?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I will. Now, a few things. What we have to remember is what is important is not that the imports come in, and you have to have, if you have a lot of, it's not the reserves. Reserves are like a safety cushion. Okay. So imports are should be funded through export earnings. It's like we are like the whole country is facing the rest of the world. We export to the rest of the world, we earn dollars, and then we import from the rest of the world. And that's how we can afford to have imports. We shouldn't borrow, but we can afford to, because of our exports being high. So this is why the total volume, that is the quantity of exports, matters, right? So if you have lots of exports, you can have lots of imports. It's not the reserves. If basically a country, remember I said that our exports used to be about 39% of GDP, and it's come down to 21.5%. Well, if we had 39% of GDP, we can have lots of imports. It's like a cash flow. You get money in and you spend it. That allows you to spend it. It's when you don't have enough money and you're not exporting that you have to draw on your reserves. Okay? Because the reserves are, think of the economy like a one big household. You export to the rest of the world, you get income, you can buy things, but the reserves are your bank account. You don't want to use what your savings account is. Your savings, basically, it's the country's savings are in those reserves. So my answer is export more, and that way you can import more. But you have to start, when you have import controls, the problem is that the producers are not incentivized to exports. It's much easier for them to produce something, say tiles. So put tiles, household tiles. Everybody, people put tiles in their household. We restrict the amount of tiles that are imported. Now, guess what our tile manufacturer is going to do? It's going to charge us more. You think they're going to bother to export? No. And their quality is not good enough. That's okay, because if you export, you have to have good quality. So they become inefficient, lazy producers. They should be really competing in the market. That is why countries like Korea grew fast, because they export to the rest of the world. So the reason you have to get rid of import controls is because it then incentivizes, the profits are in exporting. So the reserves are not really meant to finance imports. We only do it because we don't have enough exports. So that's number one. Reserves are really like our savings account in a bank. It's the country's savings. Okay, it's a stock. Now, you're worried about paying debt. Same thing. The debt should not be financed from reserves. Debt is a stock. When it gets restructured, we will have a stream of interest payments that will come, that is predictable from that. And the way we have to pay that, the domestic part is, of course, through our tax revenue raised domestically. And the external part is what the export earnings allows us to do, is to have enough foreign exchange in the market. The government can go and buy the foreign exchange and pay off the government debt. It's not the job of the central bank to pay government debt. Central bank's job is to protect the value of your currency. It's the government's job to tax exporters in foreign exchange, or taxes enough that it can go to the central bank, give the rupees and say, please exchange this for foreign exchange. And the central bank will do it. It can go to the market and purchase the foreign exchange. It doesn't need to use its reserves. And then it'll pay off the government debt. So countries that have high reserves often don't, they're just sitting there. It's like a savings account. So it's a mistake to think that somehow you need high reserves to pay your debt, or that you need high reserves to pay for imports. It's only because you're not earning enough foreign exchange. If you, on a normal basis, earned a lot of foreign exchange, like Thailand or Malaysia or these countries, they have big reserves, but they don't use them. They just keep it like a saving for a rainy day. If you get a sudden shock, you can use your reserves. But they basically earn enough exports. So their export ratios are 40% of GDP, something like that, or more, 40, 50, 60% of GDP. They earn enough that they can pay for their imports and pay their debts. So that's what we should do. And that's what I'm saying, remove the import controls, because they are the biggest anti-export bias in the economy. Because why would you, we have, for years, since I was a little girl, and that's a long time ago, we had tea, rubber, coconut, and garments. We haven't added any other product to our exports. But we have domestic producers who are producing tiles, they produce all sorts of things, but only to sell domestically. They are not good enough to sell abroad. That tells you something. So get rid of the import controls. That way you stop protecting them. And you and I, if you want to start a business and want to export, whatever, we can get the imports. Remember, to export, you often need to import, right? So you have to import your raw materials, import your packaging materials, and then you export. But the cost of your imports is less than what you would earn from your exports. So that's how normal economies should be working. They should not. Import restrictions hurt our ability to export.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Next, we have Suren with us. Suren, you can ask your question.
Good evening, everyone. I think I'm clearly audible for you. First of all, I would like to thank for this insightful and informative session today. My question to you is, Doctor, I believe as citizen, it is very important if we have knowledge on evaluation economic policies presented by political parties, especially during election period. According to you, how can we strengthen general public who haven't much knowledge in economic to take an approach to evaluate those economic policies while encouraging them to wisely use their votes in election? I would like to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the difficult things when we get into elections. Sri Lanka has traditionally had politicians promise all kinds of things, and then they try to deliver on some of them at least, and things go very badly, right? So how do we challenge that they have responsible policies and that they promise responsible things? I think there are civil society and think tanks and research outfits in Sri Lanka like Verite, Advocata. I mean, they're constantly, and there might be ones that are more for Sinhalese speaking. I know Advocata puts things out in Sinhalese and Tamil, but Sinhalese and Tamil maybe analysis coming out in those languages as well. But if not, at least use the English ones and use that as a basis to challenge politicians. I mean, I think citizens, you're right, you're absolutely right, have to hold the politicians accountable. And so educating the public is a big role that people could play. I think that's one of the reasons why my colleague Insuchit Shanta and I, we try to talk to people. We want people to be aware that irresponsible promises are, certain promises are not credible. They're irresponsible. If any politician tells you that they're going to reduce taxes, it is just not possible. They will invite another disaster. So I think as citizens have to kind of question them and push back, and you have resources to be able to inform yourself. I'm more of an economist than a political advisor, but I would say that is my suggestion.
Thank you, Doctor. Next, we have Meshani. Mishani, you can go ahead and ask a question.
Dr. Shamini, I have a question. Are there any historical precedent or lessons from previous election in Sri Lanka that could inform our understanding of the relationship between political transitions and economic reforms?
You know, we had economic reform that I remember in my lifetime. Like, look, I grew up in the 1970s, early 70s. When I was a teenager, there were queues everywhere. We had to stand in line to get food, rice, flour. We had not many vegetables. It was in such bad shape, the economy, because all the imports were restricted. And there was no production. You can ask 71, 72, 73. And we had a big oil price shock. And then in 77, a new government came in. I'm not espousing any political party because those parties have all made mistakes, the kind that I'm talked about. But that government did liberalize. In one go, they took out the import controls in 1977. And the economy grew, exports grew very sharply. They devalued the exchange rate, and at that time the exchange rate was controlled, and the economy just grew. And if you look at a chart of our export to GDP ratio, the exports, this is why I say don't get rid of the import controls. I would love to see a reform like that, because what happened was immediately after they liberalized imports, exports grew. The ratio of exports expanded very sharply. There was also a time in the 90s when we had more liberal economic policies, meaning trade was encouraged. And that's why through the 90s, our export ratio grew, and it peaked in the year 2000. So there have been episodes where governments have changed and then got rid of restrictions. And exports have responded, and frankly, the economy grew for a long time. So the problem we've had in the last decade is that we have, particularly after the end of the Civil War, after 2009, we have had very state-driven growth. So basically, the government borrowed and restricted imports, and we grew, but grew in a way that was not sustainable. So it was fueled by debt. Our debt ratios were not high in the 80s and 90s. So yes, we have had that. And so we should go, have another kind. I would love to see somebody that actually promised deep reforms. And that's why I'm saying, get rid of the import controls. That's not the only thing I'm saying. It's because I'm saying you can't have a controlled economy and expect to grow. And if we don't grow at something like 6% a year, we are going to go into another debt crisis. I didn't elaborate on this point, but I think a previous person who asked a question about the speech I gave on during my central bank oration, our debt to GDP ratio still ends up very high, even by the year 2032. We still are going to be spending 6 to 7% of GDP in interest payments by the year 2028, right? So that's as far as the fiscal projections that I can see from the IMF, basically go that far. And if we are spending 6.5% of GDP in tax, in interest payments, then you have to have a reasonable tax collection. So we have to have these reforms to free up the economy. And in 1977, it was done in one go. Just overnight, they got rid of the import controls and liberalized the exchange. And we were one of the earliest liberalizers. A lot of developing countries at the time had very restricted imports. We were one of the first, we and Chile, I think, were one of the first to get rid of these import controls, and it benefited the country. But our political vested interests kind of slowly got them back on again. So we got to do it again.
Thank you, Doctor. I hope.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Next, we have Another. Another, you can go ahead and ask question.
Thank you, Sean, and good evening, madam. I have a question. In according to this current situation in Sri Lanka and according to economic crisis in Sri Lanka, we're gonna talking about Indian engagements. Example, that port Sri Lanka Colombo port incidents and then telecom and also that like examples. What do you think about the impact on our country through their buying our companies?
Look, we have to be open to growth and foreign investment. And India, of course, is our biggest neighbor. And I think the important thing is to make sure that these things are done in a competitive way. So it doesn't matter if it's India or China or US or Australia or whoever, or Thailand for that matter. What we have to do have proper rules. So, for example, if there are projects, let's say, I don't know, energy projects, I remember I mentioned about having a public procurement law. So one of the things is to have investment proposals within that law. If a good law would do this, you would have a system of vetting investment proposals and making sure that the procurement of goods are done in a way, if public money is involved, in a way that is transparent and competitive. So, for example, we shouldn't just simply, to any country, just say, okay, yeah, you go give me that energy project or road or whatever. It should be open to tenders, and you tender it and evaluate the tenders and then give it, have a contract with whichever country is the best supplier of that service, goods or services or whatever it might be. Maybe an energy project, maybe a road. So that is really what is important. Now, India in particular, this lacking transparency is the problem, I think, that you're getting at. And then that raises concerns, right? Is this the best source of investment? Are there more efficient companies that could come and provide us with the same service for a lower cost? And I think so it's not India in particular. I think the process has to be one that selects the best, most competitive investor for public projects. For private projects, I think they should be free to invest in whatever. So that's one thing. The other thing we have to remember, of course, is that India is, of course, a market that is growing at 6, 7, 8% a year. It's a massive market, and we should get access to that market. So it has to be a two-way deal. They want to come here, but then we get access to their market. And Indian markets can be a little bit protected beyond kind of, I think, experience that. So we have to get a deal, a trade agreement such that our producers can export to India. Just imagine, Mumbai alone has more people than all of Sri Lanka. If our companies could export tiles or whatever you want to call it to India, we would do pretty well. We would get very rich very quickly. So we can't shut ourselves up. We have to open ourselves up. And look, Sri Lanka has an educated workforce. We have competent people. We can do these things. We shouldn't be so afraid. So Indian investor wants to come here, produce something, export it back to India, fine. But we should also have access to Indian market. So that would be my answer. So have two things: transparent public investment and procurement processes, so that the best investors are chosen for spending public money, public projects, public-private partnerships, whatever. And the second, that's why we need a good procurement and public investment law. And the second thing is to have equal access to Indian markets or other markets.
Thank you so much, madam, for the pointed explanation and nice explanation. And thank you for giving this opportunity.
Sure.
And next we have Sachitra Karyavasam. Sachitra.
Thank you for this golden opportunity. So I am Satitra Karisam from Matara. Ma'am, I have a small question. As a young activism, we see the International Monetary Fund, it's IMF, as an effective program. So, but many politician party in Sri Lanka, they ignore this IMF programs. So, my question is, does this contain proposal that affect our country and country economic growth or community development?
Sorry, so the question is, does the IMF supported program help
Yeah,
us?
my question is, our most of political parties, they ignore to IMF.
Yeah.
So my question is, in IMF proposal to affect our country or country economic or community development?
Yeah, I mean, look, politicians in other countries as well, but in Sri Lanka certainly, love to attack the IMF and say, oh, the IMF is what's killing us and IMF is doing this and that. But IMF is merely a lender of last resort, okay? Nobody has to go to them and borrow money from them. But then countries do because they have nobody else that will lend to them because they're so mismanaged. That's us. 17 times we've gone to them. So I would say the fact that politicians attack or sort of want to ignore the IMF programs, that is what has happened 17 times in the past. We kind of implement it and then we don't quite implement it. I think 9 of the 16 programs before this one is the 17th, went off track. So meaning they didn't implement everything. And that has been our weakness. The IMF has often asked us to do the structural reforms. The kind of things that I outlined have been in past programs. This is not new, okay? But we have not done that. So politicians will kind of make it sound like, oh yeah, we can kind of get away without doing this stuff. But it's tough for them. Frankly, for us, if they did these reforms, we would grow and most of us would have the freedom, the economic opportunities to do better. But we don't get a chance. So I would say the IMF basically is trying to make sure that we can repay the money we borrow from them and that we are in a sustainable debt situation. But it is not their job, it's not their responsibility to make sure that we grow. They don't want to damage our growth. They will try to make us do things but they're not going to punish us in terms of not giving money if we don't undertake some of these reforms. So because it's up to the country, at the end of the day, it's up to the citizens and the country to do the proper reforms. The IMF can't impose these things, and they will only impose the minimum, which is fiscal responsibility, to make sure that the money we borrow from them gets paid back, because it's not in our interest not to pay the IMF back. That would damage us even more, and they want their money back. I mean, they're not a charity. So they will have a reasonable set of reforms, but it's not enough. What I'm trying to say is it's not enough only to do those reforms. We have to go more than that because we want to grow. And I'm saying that when I say a growth of 6%, that's more than what the IMF has in the program. But remember something, the IMF is not trying to stop us from growing. They're simply telling us what the absolute minimum is, right? But the absolute minimum leaves us open to another shock. So we have to do better than the absolute minimum. And that's where, our political parties need to kind of come together. I've said this before. Our political parties, have to come together and have a common platform, have to agree on a set of things that even if the government changes, they will continue to do, whichever side. There's plenty to disagree about. But there's core things on the management of the fiscal, the independence of the central bank, the privatization of state enterprises, the getting rid of import controls, and making it a more export-oriented economy. These are things that are, to me, no-brainers. So the fact that they want to compete by trying to kind of differentiate themselves on these, at least, things are not, to me, very productive. So we will. And the final point I want to make on what you ask is, if we deviate from the minimum program that the IMF, we have agreed with the IMF, and that underpins the debt restructuring, believe me, this time is different. We are going to be in such bad trouble. You think that 22 crisis was bad? It will be much worse, because nobody is going to help us. They helped us. India came and helped us in 22. They gave $3.5 billion or so. Nobody else would give us, not China, not the IMF, nobody would touch us. So next time we kind of screw up again, I mean, we will be on our own. So we should, as citizens, be aware that there is a very tight path ahead of us. So I would say that we need to follow the IMF program, but we need to do even better than that, meaning have deeper reforms than are in the program.
Thank you, Doctor. Next, we have Harsha from Polonnaruwa. He already sent us the question as in chat as well. Anyway, since he raised his hand, I think he can talk. Harsha?
Good evening, madam.
Hello.
I am Harsha Vijayapala from Polonnaruwa. First of all, I give my sincere thanks for you for conducting most valuable presentation for us on behalf of the liberal youth movements. So my question is, in your experience, what criteria we need to adopt? Not only we need to adopt as electing new governments to respond post-elections challenges, such as challenging some economic landscape, social demands, as well as international relations with through policy adjustment. And it's better to explain success story taken from the another country also. Thank you, madam.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would like to see us as citizens ask our parties to agree on a minimum set of reforms, that we can. This is not a time for politics as usual. We are in a very bad situation even now. It's not over. This crisis is not over. We've just about kind of gotten through the worst of it. But it's not over. It's not over. Many people, you're in Polonnaruwa. People are still suffering. They still have not enough food, not enough opportunities, not enough income. And they need jobs, and they need to have more productive farming. And there is just a lot going on that we are by no means in a good place. So we have to kind of have even a bigger push for reforms, and the government, the different parties need to agree to that. So we as citizens should ask them to have policy continuity. There's an example from India. I mean, when the Manmohan Singh, that government had reforms in India in the early 90s. There was another government after that, but basically the Modi government that came afterwards, they continued the same policies, and the same thing happens in countries like Thailand. You ask for examples. I mean, Thailand politics is a mess. I mean, they have sit-ins, they have this guy who's, the military comes in, then there's this guy Thaksin who kind of wants to come back, and I mean, they have a lot of problems, but their economy is well managed. They do not go on a spending spree. They do not cut taxes randomly. They have, like I said, a very small fiscal deficit, about 1%, 2% of GDP, not that much, a very low debt ratio. They're independent central bank. The Bank of Thailand is a very powerful and independent and responsible institution. So they grow. I mean, these countries were poorer than us, and in the 60s, 70s, they're much richer because they kind of have fiscal responsibility. And also, I mean, quite frankly, a lot of Southeast Asia doesn't have this philosophy that the government has to own everything and run everything. That's not their philosophical outlook. They don't have big statist policies. They have always, they tend to support private markets and kind of expect people to participate. So we have to be more like those countries and kind of, have better fiscal policies and independent central bank. And like I said, if a core agenda of, raising the tax ratio, getting the fiscal policy to be sustainable, meaning we generate the requisite surpluses to cover our interest payments. We we respect the independence of the central bank. We privatize commercially oriented state enterprises, and we lift the import controls and encourage exports, not through tax cuts, but by making it easier to do business in Sri Lanka. I mean, if we can agree on that, we would prosper. Sri Lankans are capable people. We don't have to be afraid of competition from abroad. So I think I would like to see that. And there are examples of countries that have better run and have. Thailand got into a crisis and they reformed themselves. And that they only went to the IMF a couple of times. That's it. We've gone 17 times. So we have to stop doing this. So I'm hoping that the, citizen engagement, people like you, will hold our politicians responsible, because I do believe that young people are the hope. You are better educated, better informed, and you will hold politicians accountable for making promises that are going to get us into trouble, and at least having a common set of sensible economic policies. There's a lot of other things they can disagree on. I'm not saying everybody has to agree on everything. If we can agree on a core set of economic policies, we would all be better off.
Thank you, Doctor. Next, we have Zawfir. Zawfir.
Good evening, Dr. Farid. I have a couple of points. One is that IMF has come up with the governance diagnostics, which implementing that will be a real challenge. And you and I know it very well. Implementing this country in the backdrop of the type of politicians that we are dealing with is going to be a monumental task. And the other one is that I don't see a quick fix in the next 3 to 5 years at least, because our products are traditional products, and the products that we go into the export market is a mundane product, which is like everyone else is offering. So there is no uniqueness unless we come up with something unique through export market oriented products that will have a differentiation compared to the other countries. I don't see, at least in the next 10 years, it's going to be a dark story for us. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but that is a real fact. Because I don't know where we are heading to, and with these elections around the corner, with none of them, providing some clarity of in the way forward, I assume the worst. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, my thought to you, my question to you is, how do we come out of this? Because I have heard well-respected economists talking about this, but then it's ultimately translating that into actions. And I don't see who is going to take that mantle and then get that transformed into actions and make a country. I would have thought it's better had the Brits continued since 1948 rather than giving some of these third-grade nincompoops to run our country.
Okay, so I'll be optimistic. Look, the governance diagnostic is good reading. I think it tells us in plain language what's wrong. I mean, it gives recommendations. So it's up to us and up to you. You're young. You must push. That's why youth are the hope for Sri Lanka now, because my generation screwed things up. But the youth can change, and you can. I do believe very much that people can change their own societies, and you are all of you are more educated than your counterparts from 50 years ago, right? 40 years ago. You are more capable. You know what the rest of the world is like. You know that some things are just kind of nonsense, and you have seen the corruption. We have learned from the last few decades. What have we learned? That state-driven policies, state capture, political patronage, this is not the way to develop. So we are in trouble. We got into trouble because this model essentially ran out of steam, right? It just took us to a very bad place. So now we can change. I do believe you can make it happen. Other instances exist where, we have a few good things in Sri Lanka. One of them is that we are a democracy. And we are increasingly, I'm happy to say, increasingly multi-ethnic, multi-religious, accepting of the richness of our culture, not just one culture, everybody's culture. So I think people are beginning to appreciate that this is not about, our politicians divided us in the past according to ethnic, religious lines. I'm seeing young people, I saw it in the Aragalaya movement, just being more multi-ethnic, inclusive, talking, in a common language. That's, to each other, kind of not literally a common language, but, in whatever way communicating. This is important. That's how things change. That's, politicians should not be allowed to play the kind of ethnic division card they did in the past and then follow really bad policies. So I think people have learned, and I think people like you will now have to demand better. Maybe it's hard in the next election cycle, in this coming one, but it'll happen over time. So you have to take hope and courage and believe in that. And I think the diagnostic and the things I'm saying are very consistent. In fact, a lot of what I draw is from the diagnostic. These core set of policies can be done. And I think it shouldn't be difficult to agree to this. The reason people object to things like getting rid of import control sometimes is because that's where the corruption is. That's how they get their money to fund elections, etc. So we have to just see through that and just simply say, no, we don't want that. On whether, your point on how can we produce stuff, increasingly, and it is no longer true that countries produce a product 100% in their country and then export it. Almost no country does it anymore. Only commodity exports are like that. Manufactured exports they're what are called value chains. So basically, part of the product is done in Vietnam, part it is done in China, it's brought to another country, it's processed some more, and then it's exported. And that's why these multinationals are often kind of have production across countries. So a lot of Chinese countries, for example, companies have invested in Vietnam. And they produce some stuff in China, some stuff in Vietnam, etc. But it doesn't have to be through companies. Even, let's say, there are companies in Southeast Asia that will get products from different producers in other countries. They will import the stuff, they will process it, and be part of a value chain. So Sri Lanka doesn't have to produce the whole thing. We only need to produce a part of something. Vietnam has done very well by producing parts of things. Malaysia, same thing. I mean, they'll produce a small part of an electronic good and maybe a car part, and it may be part of an engine, and then it's exported to some other place. But you still earn money, earn exports from export earnings from that. So what the terminology is called integrating into value chains, right? So these big supply chains exist across multiple countries. If you buy a car in America, it's not made in America. The thing is made in several places, and some part of it might be produced in America. Same thing. Any goods that we see is a multiple countries supplying. It can say made in China, but some of those components are coming from Vietnam, from other Thailand, from other parts of Asia. So that we are, unfortunately, because we restrict our imports, and we are like a tortoise, like a iba, we just all refusing to participate in this. We have to open ourselves up and allow the foreign direct investment to come in. We don't have to give tax concessions. We just have a standard tax rate for them. They want continuity. That's what they want. And then they want to be able to produce whatever they produce, and part of it, but it will be only a component of some other thing. That's fine. That's fine. So this is why, it's not important for us to think, what might be imported, what might be produced that is unique and different. We don't have to. It might be something that is a part of some other thing. And that's why connecting to India is important, because Indian companies may well decide to produce something in Sri Lanka and then re-export it back to India. Now, services is another area. Look, things like shipping logistics, back office functions, the kind of things that happen in Singapore and Dubai, which are getting increasingly expensive. We can do this in Sri Lanka. We have lots of accountants. We have one of the highest concentration of accountants in the world. We have a lot of people who are good in IT. We need to educate. We need to have better educational institutions. We, open up the private tertiary, like a post high school education, and kind of have IT skills done more. I mean, that's possible. I mean, it's happening. And Sri Lankans are, we found out that they can emigrate, right? I mean, this crisis up, people just started to emigrate because they have skills. So I wouldn't be pessimistic. We can export services. So that's why you have to let the market work, because no planner, you, me alone, knows where the opportunities are. But that is why liberal thinking is individuals. The market signal. That's why you shouldn't control prices. The market signal, when the price rises, when the exchange rate is beneficial to exporting rather than importing, right? So you have a devalued exchange rate, it's good for export. People find what it is that they can do. And people are smart as a population. They're much smarter as a population, much cleverer than any one politician. So we don't have to sort of sit and think about, we don't have to have a grand plan what we're going to export. We should simply let people decide what is profitable and give them the space to do it. Right now, we restrict that space. We don't allow them to import. We don't allow them to export. We kind of, it's not that we don't allow them to export, we make it difficult. Customs is a mess. So that's why we need to, that's where I see Sri Lanka can thrive. I'm quite convinced that we can. We just need to get off people's back.
Thank you, Doctor. Next, we have a question we received from Vinesh. I already sent this question to you in chat as well. His question is, it seems like the government is pursuing an expansionary economic policy by offering more subsidies to a broader audience, while the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is implementing a contractionary monetary policy. This discrepancy might be causing confusion and lacks clarity in the overall economic policy direction, doesn't it? My second question pertains to the practice of collecting high taxes from the working classes and redistributing those funds as subsidies to a larger audience. What is your perspective on this approach? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So actually, now, at this moment, the government is not pursuing an expansionary fiscal policy. Our fiscal is tightening. The way you can see tightening is that our non-interest balance, it's called the primary balance, is actually increasing, meaning it's gone into surplus now for the first time in several years. Okay, so we used to have, it was in a big deficit, and I can show you that chart. It went into a big deficit in one of the charts I showed, and now it's in a surplus. So the government is actually contracting. The overall, we're saving enough now to pay our interest back. So in fact, the government is tightening, and that's why. So increasing taxes is a way that you tighten, because you increase the revenue, you cut our non-interest expenditure excluding interest payments have contracted sharply. And so it's tight. Now the central bank had to tighten policy because inflation reached 70%, right? And so immediately in March, when the new central bank governor took over in April, he increased the interest rates very sharply. That's a contraction, true. But then, and that he needed to do that because the inflation was zooming up, exchange rate was weakening, but if the inflation was zooming up, there's always a lag, and it peaked in September at close to over 70%. And then, but it came down after that because of the tightening of the monetary policy. But since May 23, monetary policy has been loosened. Interest rates have been cut very, very sharply. You would have noticed that interest rates used to be about 20%. They're back down to about 8-9%. At least the prime lending rates have come down. The central bank rate is now about 9%. 8.5%, between 8.5% and 9%. So basically it's the other way around. Fiscal is tightening and monetary is relaxing. And that doesn't cause confusion. In fact, very often the central bank may be counteracting the government. So basically the government needs to contract. Why? Because it has a debt burden. It has to get to debt sustainability. But the central bank, now that it has fought the inflation off, and inflation has come down, inflation in Sri Lanka it went up temporarily to 5-6%, but now it's back down to, it's about 1%, 2%. It rose up, the price level is not coming down, but the rate at which the price level increases has stabilized. So now the central bank has room to cut, and they're cutting interest rates in order to help the private economy grow. So the economy is starting to grow. We are seeing some first few the quarter that growth has been positive. Weak, but so because the central bank is now doing the right thing, there's no need to tighten the rest of the economy. The fiscal has to tighten, but this is what I'm saying. The private sector is the most of the economy, so let it borrow, and we don't have a private sector borrowing problem. So let the private sector borrow and grow, invest and grow. So that's what's happening there. Now, sorry, the second part of the question was on, taxing poor people. Look, I agree that we need to do better at taxing the well-off people and not so much the working people. And this is why Sri Lanka needs to change its tax structure more from indirect taxes, meaning goods and services taxes, to like VAT, to taxing direct income, right? So from corporations and from rich individuals. Our tax thresholds only, like I said, tax the top 15% of the population. Somebody earning 50,000 rupees is not getting taxed. They don't have a tax file. There's no need for them to pay taxes. So you have to have 100,000 rupees a month and that's the top 15% of the population. But we need to, the problem is not the rate, the problem is that for those in Colombo, you go to PETA, you think how many of those people are paying taxes. They make plenty of profits, but they are not, I guarantee you, I'm pretty sure they don't pay enough taxes. We have to just administer, the diagnostic report from the IMF is very critical of our tax collecting practices. We have to automate these systems. We have to get more people in the tax umbrella. That way we can have a fairer tax system. But I agree, we have to have a fairer tax system. We shouldn't give tax breaks to corporations. We don't need to tax them unfairly, but we should have a flat tax for them. And we are giving exemptions to connected political politically connected individuals. And that's what I said in my speech. I mean, you just have to stop taxing poorer people and tax them better off. And you can still get to 15-16% of GDP in tax revenue that way.
Thank you, Doctor. I think these are all questions we have. If anyone else has a question, please raise your hand or you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Dr. Pune, may I ask another question if that is okay with you?
Sure.
Yeah. I know you're very positive about the outlook, but you know the different dynamics of the Sri Lankan politics and economics, which goes hand in glove. Realistically, do you believe that we can come out of the rut, say, within the next 10 years? Or what kind of fundamental changes that we need to make to get to a situation where we can at least feel that we have now started to rebuild our foundations, strengthen our pillars, and moving forward? Because there is a wrong notion that we will become a fully fledged economy, or rather developed economy status in 2048, which is a long way to go, right? So we need to take baby steps before that to put things in place. Before even thinking that far. Of course, we have to think long term, but we have to do the actions right now to put in place. So you have been associated with the Sri Lankan setup. So do you honestly feel, because when I talk to few people who are independent, they tell me even in next 10 years, unless our voters' mindset is, maybe we might have to build an AI chip into their brain to make sure they have a rational decision that they make at the time of votes. So what is your take on this, Dr. Pure?
I think it's up to us. Nothing is written. Nothing says that we can't do it. Other countries got into trouble and changed and grew faster. India is an example. India got into a crisis, and then in the early 90s, they had the big reforms. And like I said, Prime Minister Modi continued those reforms. Thailand got into trouble and had deep structural changes. Korea did. I worked on Korea, and they had to change some of the things. Some of their banking system went bankrupt. So countries do reform. We can too. So what I'm trying to say is, it's not written that you can't do it. Neither is it written that we will get out of it. It's up to us. And I believe in in liberal thinking, in the sense that the individual matters, and the individual agency, as we say, that is the capacity of the individual to bring about change and bring about, their own, be able to act in a way that furthers their self-interest. Come on, earn a living, whatever. But that is also good for the nation. So there is a way to do it. And Adam Smith, I saw it, Sean had it on his bookshelf, but that was his insight, right? And so I believe very much that people like you can make a difference. And if you shouldn't lose hope, you should think that you are the change. You are the change. So you should, the fact of demanding better policies, more fiscal responsibility. Next time a politician tells you that they're going to deliver everything, ask them, what's the price of that? How are you going to pay for it? Where are you going to get the money to pay for this thing without borrowing? Ask them those questions. And I know they don't exactly allow themselves to be questioned, but don't vote for them then. Vote for another. I know our electoral system is captured, but it's hard to get a new party. But maybe you form a liberal party. So you can make the political changes. I do believe that's possible. The economic stuff, believe me, it's not rocket science. It is not hard. I mean, what I'm saying is it's obvious what we need to do. the things I outlined, these 4 pillars and kind of the core parts of better governance, better ways of taking decisions. That, look, the world has over the past few decades learned it, right? Is there any country in the world that has developed, and I mean go from low income to higher income through state control? No, not even China. China only grew after Deng Xiaoping instituted reforms that essentially made it a capitalist economy. Maybe not totally market, but pretty capitalist. That's why China and what does China do? It exports its way. We all know that China is now like a huge exporter, exports just about everything. Well, that's an example of a country that, in a sense, changed, but it rejected state-run, state-owned things, the things that Alibaba, all these big Chinese companies, Tencent, these Chinese companies more than I do. The Communist Party might influence them, but they don't really run them. I mean, Deng Xiaoping allowed these companies to happen, meaning, capital, private capital to be formed. And China grew only after that. And China grew only after it started exporting. So this is what I'm trying to say, that even a very highly controlled economy like China, and we shouldn't try to be like China. I mean, it's a communist party, it's not a democracy. But the fact is that even they did not do it by state control and import controls and not exporting and all the rest of it. I mean, that's a massive country, but they didn't do it that way. So not all countries, but the economic model to me is very clear what has worked. So the economic part is not hard to figure out. What is hard is to get the political will, to get the vested interests that control our economy out of the way. I mean, they need to be, that whole thing has to be dismantled, and we have to have a liberalization. Like I said, in 1977, we liberalized. We should have another liberalization so that vested interests and all these politically connected ways of doing business are gotten rid of. I know it won't be easy, but it's possible. We have to do it because the future is not good otherwise. So for you young people, you have to be the change. You have to demand it from your leaders.
Thank you, Doctor.
And I think it's possible. I'm an optimist. It's possible.
So I have a question to ask. You mentioned several times that liberal thinking is important when it comes to these economic measures as well. So can you explain a bit more about like how liberal thinking can impact this?
So liberal thinking, I mean, the books on your shelf, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, those are the initial philosophers. But economics has progressed quite a lot through trial and error and economic thinking. So how does liberal thinking work into this? Well, what is the role of the individual and what's the role of the state? So the kind of economic model that has shown to work, and this is why I said, shows that individuals acting in their self-interest, that's what Adam Smith talked about, right? Meaning the market is a bunch of individuals transacting to improve themselves. But because of the way the market works, it actually ends up increasing the total amount of goods and services the economy is able to produce. And the reason is when something is scarce, the prices rise, and then somebody says, I can make a profit from this, and then produces that thing, and then the price comes down. So the power of individual agency, the ability of the individual to make decisions for themselves. Why should the government tell you what to do? Why should you have to go to political person to get a permit for this and that. No, I mean, you should not. So that core function of the individual is very much embedded in liberal thinking. The other thing is the role of the state. It's not about, the state needs to do everything. It has to produce for you. It has to feed you. It has to clothe you. No, you can clothe yourself if you only have the ability to create your own business or your own jobs, or go work for somebody that you think is a better option. Whatever is best for you. The government's role is to keep markets competitive. That is to make sure that this market functions well, right? So most of the time it doesn't need to do anything. But there are some areas where markets don't work very well, like health. We will underinvest in health if you leave it to the market. Okay, so it's one of the good things Sri Lanka has done is have free education and free health care. In my view, that's one thing we got right. It's deteriorating because of the way our fiscal has been managed. So that is part of the kind of thing that John Stuart Mill and people would have. He thought it was okay for the market to impose a tax on, say, alcohol, because alcohol is something that actually damages public health, and our cigarettes. You can tax those things, right? So there is this role that the government plays, protecting the environment, having environmental regulations, health standards, protecting. Look at the human-elephant conflict. That is something the government needs to do something about. I am trying to understand that tragedy that's happening to our rural people and to the elephants. But that is a failure of the state not doing the role, because private markets can't solve those problems. So what I'm trying to say is there's a proper role for the state, but unfortunately in Sri Lanka, it's sort of taken over commercial activities. We don't need 160 commercially oriented state-owned enterprises. You are paying a price for that through your taxes. So the consistency with liberal thinking is in the role of the state, that the state should be an enabler of markets, and allow trade to happen without restrictions with the rest of the world, so that thinkers like Ricardo showed, and also Adam Smith, but also David Ricardo, showed that when you trade, you produce more by producing the things you're good at, and it's called comparative advantage, and that actually enriches you more than if you just only produced what you can and ate what you can. That's a subsistence economy. Trading economies can do better, and they showed it. So allowing markets to work across internationally as well is important. Like I said, very prosperous countries like the Nordics, they are trading nations. They always export, and even big ones like China, they export. So you have to have this open regime. Not that China is liberal, but I'm just saying those things are very consistent with liberal thinking. So we have to redefine our economic model from state-controlled, state-oriented, all of which has bred patronage and corruption, which I spoke about in my speech at the central bank. We have to move away from that and empower individuals to act and to be able to look after their own prosperity, while the state provides essential things like education, healthcare, and looking after the poor. The very poor, the truly poor, who are like the bottom 20% of the population, have cash transfers for themselves so they can improve themselves, and they have the kind of opportunities that better off people have. Those are all very legitimate things. So, and environmental standards, food standards, safety standards, those are things government should do. So kind of redefining the role of the state. Those are all, I think, the model we need to move to.
Thank you, Doctor. We have one more question. We have a question from Udara. Udara? Yes, Tracy.
Thank you, Sean. Doctor, I have one question. One of the least head of economics policies during the election season is supporting small business. In Sri Lanka banking system, there is a big problem in granting loans to small business. Something like you need to show property of 5 lakhs to get a loan of 1 lakh. There are almost no tax breaks if it is easy for small business to get loan, and if tax concessions are given, what kind for loss or advantage will the government have?
So, first of all, I would say there is no need for tax concessions. First of all, you have to make a profit to be taxed. Otherwise, you know, the VAT is really a tax on the value added part. It's not a tax really on the, it's not a direct tax, right? Because you get reimbursed for the inputs and you only pay the tax on the difference. But the bigger point, you know, what I think we should think of is it's not the government's business to aid every small business. That's, you know, think of the US. I mean, there are a lot of small businesses, you know, people, but the government's not involved. It's the capital markets that do it. And we don't really have a developed capital market. So that's the problem. But I think we should not think of the government's role is to help small businesses. I know that's a bit controversial, what I said just now, but I agree that banks are not, it's hard because banks will only lend if they're sure they can get, you know, they have some security, some collateral. Now, microfinance, that is financing for small businesses of the kind you're talking about, is something that can be encouraged, not necessarily through subsidies, but through regulations that allow lenders to lend on the basis of the profitability rather than asking for collateral. And there are, so one of the things that, for example, is happening is there are other competitors that are not banks that are coming because we are kind of liberalizing, you know, because of telecom. For example, digital banking, you know, one of the things that microfinance does is it lends based on your credit history. So government could do things like form a credit reporting agency. Credit reporting agencies, they collect the behavior of people, how often they pay their bills. Do they pay bills regularly? And they score people on how well they keep up with their debt payments. You know, everybody has small amounts of debt and they pay it back. Do they pay their rent on time? You know, credit bureaus collect this information. We don't have this credit reporting system in Sri Lanka. That will enable micro institutions, microfinance institutions to actually lend to small businesses. I mean, I agree with you that there isn't enough financing for small businesses, but this is the way it's done in other places. So government's role is to really enable the credit reporting so that the lender has good info. It doesn't have to be a bank, has good information and can lend small amounts to small businesses without collateral, you know. Small businesses have a high rate of failure. That's not a bad thing. That's just fact of life. And so having good credit history is a way in which many countries have done lending to small businesses. You know, you lend to people with good credit history, but then you have to create the credit history so government can establish or encourage or enable the provision of credit reporting institutions. But, we shouldn't think the government, we can't afford subsidies like that. Why should we have government handouts? We shouldn't, that's not a sustainable thing. And governments can't afford, and our government certainly can't afford. The government's not in the business of picking winners, right? Because if it's your business that's successful, but not the other guys, but then the government gave a subsidy to the other guy, they're going to just lose money. And then there's a taxpayer, which is going to be you paying for that. There's no free lunch, as Milton Friedman once said, no free lunch. Everything that is subsidized has a cost. And every business that fails, that receives a government subsidy and then fails and then reneges on its debt, is going to be a cost to a future taxpayer or a current taxpayer. So that's why I say governments should be restricted to what they can do, what they're best placed to do. And private markets have to essentially do this. And microfinance is one way, but the government can create institutions like credit reporting systems. Grameen Bank in Bangladesh is one example. I think if we had less, we could deregulate a bit more. But I would say that's the best way. That would be a better way to do it. I think in Sri Lanka, we expect the government to solve everybody's problems. And this is part of the thinking we have to get out of. In places, even communist China, you think the government, they don't even give them free education or free health. They don't have free stuff, in China. And that's supposed to be a communist country. And so, Southeast Asia doesn't give, government doesn't go around giving loans to small businesses. We have this attitude in Sri Lanka that the government has to solve all our problems. We have to, that's part of liberal thinking, is to stand up on our own feet.
Thank you very much, Doctor. This is Namini.
Yes. Hi, Namini.
Yeah, I think Shan is having some technical issue, so I had to jump in the session. Doctor, do we have any more questions? And Doctor, I think we have anyway exceeded the given time, allocated time for this session. And thank you very much for tolerating us. And thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedule and decided to be here with us today. I think everyone found, like they texted me, messaged me, everyone found this session is very informative and educational. Not every day like we get this opportunity to hear from people like you, experts like you. So Doctor, the young people who raised questions today are from Polonnaruwa, Ampara, Matara, Galle, Kalutara, Gampaha. I'm very proud of our members because of these amazing questions, actually, because
Yes.
your insightful session was complemented by the answers because of that amazing questions raised by these young, very young fellows. So they are our members. So I'm very proud of them. And also we had very new participants for this session who raised very important questions, and also the questions were from different perspectives as well. So we as Liberal Youth Movement, anyway, we are also very optimistic, and we believe tomorrow will be better than today, and today is better, obviously better than yesterday. That's why we do this kind of work, because we are very optimistic about future, about tomorrow, that we can steer this country to a better direction. We believe that. So we work tirelessly, in a sense, to achieve that. Not because of thinking about the country sometimes, but thinking about ourselves individually, to create a better country for
Yes.
me. If I work hard for that, we believe country will be gradually, it will be better if we work for ourselves. So we keep individual at the center, as you say, individual agency and individualism. And we believe individual should be the center when making policies and regulating and everything. Individual and his aspiration should be treated very well. because it's about individuals, it's about our lives, it's about achieving our goals within our lifespan. So I don't think any other thing would matter. Only thing matter would be the individual. So thank you, Doctor, very much for raising that aspect as well, connecting it with very core liberal values such as individualism and the importance of the individual. It also, I think, gave kind of a good idea to our members about how these liberal values also interconnected with economic principles as well. So that's why I think we need to learn and get ourselves educated about ideologies, concepts, and values, because it will help us to understand these very abstract economic concepts. So for me and for our members and for the participants who participated today, we all find this is a privilege. Thank you very much, Doctor. I see Shan is back, but I think Shan, I will conclude the whole session because I don't think we have any more time.
Yes.
And
Also,
yeah.
I'd like to remind everyone to fill out the post questionnaire, like survey, to.
Yes, yes, please. And in the chat, you can find our evaluation form. So with your response, we can actually organize our next session in more effective way with your response. So please respond to the evaluation form. And also in the chat, you will find links to our socials. So you please like our social media platforms, follow them to get updated about our future work, our future workshops, Zoom sessions, physical sessions, and our other initiatives. And thank you very much for participating, and thank you very much for your engagement, your valuable questions. Those questions and your engagement made this session more interesting and more insightful. Thank you very much. And also there is
Nami?
another point. Yes, Doctor.
Can I say a few words?
Yes, Doctor, please.
Just to conclude?
Yes, Doctor, please.
I wanted to do it before everybody switched off.
Yes,
I want
Doctor.
to say I'm so impressed. Like you said, I'm really impressed with the questions you posed. It shows me that you're thinking about these things, but also they're very good questions. Made me think. But I want to also say you can't lose hope. You are the future. I am optimistic. Look, in my long fund career, IMF career, I was there for 35 years. I've seen countries change, and they do because of the people. They do. And you are the change. All of you, and you're the youth. The understanding of liberal values is essentially where we need to. We as a country, have to change direction to where the rest of the world is. From our statist model to a liberal model. But more importantly, you have to be the change. You are the change, and you should take hope and courage. And I hope you will keep up this kind of work. And political change will come when people like you get active. So keep it up. And I want to say it's been a privilege to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for encouraging us. And our next session would be, the topic would be something very different. It is about sexual crimes and the actions we can take personally and also legally and technically against the sexual crimes whenever your photos or your very private videos, photos, whenever they are being leaked, what kind of actions we can take and how we can face those situations emotionally, mentally. This topic will be discussed, and the information about the session will be circulated among our groups. Also spread this word among your friends, your groups, because I think that would be very important topic in these days. We decided to do a session on that exact topic because we are receiving so many requests from our very young members and other people we know asking how they can get support of police, OSL CERT, or other organizations to get their leaked videos out from social media platforms, other groups. So we thought we should do a session on that to raise awareness about the laws and regulation related to sex crimes, as well as awareness program about how to protect your private data. So I believe you all will join and you will spread this message among your friends as well. So with that note, I think we can conclude today's session. Again, thank you, Doctor, and thank you very much to all of you, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you.